How far should a nation go to maintain its dignity? When respect is denied, does sovereignty demand a response? These are the questions that would echo across West Africa following an unprecedented diplomatic crisis that began with a simple act of disregard. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on Ouagadougou's Avenue de la Liberté, where dust particles danced in the heat waves rising from the pavement. The city hummed with the familiar symphony of motorbike engines, street vendors' calls, and the occasional blast of hip-hop music from passing vehicles. At exactly 11:43 a.m., an inconspicuous black Toyota Land Cruiser, not the polished government vehicle one might expect, pulled up half a block from the Ghanaian embassy. The man who stepped out wore no insignia of power. His faded olive button-down hung loosely over simple khaki pants. His face, partly shadowed by a worn canvas hat, carried the determined expression of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. This was Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba's successor, President Ibrahim Traoré, the 35-year-old military leader who would become Africa's youngest head of state after Burkina Faso's second coup of 2022. Captain Farouk Azaria, Traoré's closest security advisor, leaned forward from the driver's seat. "Are you certain about this approach, Mr. President?" he asked, his voice low with concern. "The Ghanaians have been making problematic statements about our military cooperation with Russia. This is precisely why protocol exists." Traoré adjusted his simple watch, a far cry from the gold-plated timepieces favored by many African leaders. "Protocol is for those who require the trappings of power to feel powerful," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him both feared and revered. "I need to speak with Ambassador Boniface Gambila directly about these accusations. No intermediaries, no diplomats filtering messages." 2 weeks earlier, Ghana's Foreign Minister Shirley Iorker Bachwe had made statements at the United Nations expressing grave concerns about Burkina Faso's growing military relationship with Russia, suggesting it was destabilizing the region. President Akufo-Addo had followed with thinly veiled criticisms about young military leaders being manipulated by external powers. The diplomatic tension had escalated when 3 Burkinabe citizens were detained in Accra under suspicious circumstances. Traoré checked his phone, noting the message from General Celestin Simpor confirming military exercises were proceeding as planned near the Mali border. The president slipped the device into his pocket and nodded once to Azaria. 90 minutes. That's all I need." Azaria knew better than to argue. The president had cultivated this habit of unannounced appearances since taking power, visiting military barracks at midnight, showing up at remote villages without warning, dropping into ministerial meetings unscheduled. It was how he maintained his reputation for omnipresence, how he kept everyone accountable. "I'll be watching," Azaria said simply. Traoré crossed the street, navigating between 2 taxis whose drivers were too engaged in animated conversation to notice the leader of their nation walking past. A fruit seller offering mangoes and papayas looked up briefly, her eyes widening with recognition before she quickly lowered her gaze, uncertain whether to acknowledge what she had seen. The Ghanaian embassy stood as a modern anomaly among the predominantly French colonial architecture of Ouagadougou, all glass and steel, constructed during the economic boom period under former Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama. Its entrance featured a small security checkpoint where 2 Ghanaian guards in crisp uniforms managed visitor access as Traoré approached. Neither guard stood at attention. Why would they? The president of Burkina Faso would surely arrive with a motorcade, with advance notice, with the full ceremonial entourage befitting his position. The taller guard, his name tag read Ajay, looked up from his phone with mild irritation at being disturbed. His colleague, shorter and stockier, shifted in his chair, sliding a clipboard forward with the visitor log. Name and purpose. Ajay stated flatly in English, barely making eye contact. Ibrahim Traoré. The president replied in the same language. "I'm here to speak with Ambassador Gambila regarding a matter of national security." The guard's eyes flicked briefly to Traoré's simple attire, then back to his face with visible skepticism. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, his tone making clear the answer he expected.
"No," Traoré replied calmly.
"But the ambassador will want to see me." The second guard snorted softly. "Everyone thinks their business is urgent. The ambassador is preparing for tomorrow's trade delegation." No unscheduled visitors. A woman in a tailored business suit exited the embassy, pausing briefly when she saw Traoré. Her expression shifted from casual disinterest to confusion to shock as recognition dawned. Mercy Tego, the embassy's deputy chief of mission, had met the president at a regional security conference 3 months earlier. She opened her mouth to speak, but Traoré gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Intrigued, she hesitated, then continued past, pulling out her phone as she walked briskly toward the embassy parking lot. "Perhaps you can arrange an appointment for next week," Ajay suggested, already reaching for a business card. "The proper channels." "I understand," Traoré interrupted quietly. "Thank you for your time." Without protest or explanation, he turned and began walking away, the same measured pace, the same unassuming demeanor. Behind him, the guards exchanged glances, shrugged, and returned to their previous activities, unaware of the diplomatic earthquake they had just triggered. Across the street, a university student named Issa Compare had been filming the entire interaction on his phone, his hand trembling slightly as he realized the significance of what he'd captured. With shaking fingers, he uploaded the video to TikTok with the caption, "They just denied entry to our president at the Ghanaian embassy. #respect, #Traoré, #Burkina dignity." As Traoré walked back toward his vehicle, he pulled out his phone and made a call, not to his security detail or foreign ministry, but to someone unexpected. "Fatoumata," he said quietly to his 19-year-old niece who managed his social media presence. "There will be a video circulating soon. Let it spread naturally." No official comment. His second call went to General Kassim Koulibaly, commander of the National Operations Command Center. "Implement Protocol 17, he said simply. "Effective immediately." At the embassy, Deputy Chief Mercy Tego rushed into Ambassador Gambila's office without knocking, interrupting his meeting with a trade representative from Kumasi. "Mr. Ambassador," she said urgently, "President Traoré was just at our gate. In person." The guards turned him away. Gambila's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. He came alone, dressed like an ordinary citizen. No security, no advance team. "Our guards didn't recognize him and denied him entry when he requested to see you." The ambassador set down his cup with deliberate care, dismissing the trade representative with a quick gesture. "How long ago?" "Less than 5 minutes." Gambila reached for his phone, but before he could dial, it began ringing, the Ghanaian foreign minister's direct line. "Boniface," came the tense voice of Shirley Iorker Botchway. "There's a video going viral showing your security turning away President Traoré. What in God's name is happening there?" "Madam Minister, I've just been informed. The video has 50,000 shares already. President Akufo-Addo has been notified. This is a diplomatic disaster." As the foreign minister continued, Gambila's attention was drawn to his window, where he noticed 3 military vehicles pulling up across the street, not close enough to be provocative, but clearly visible. "I'll call you back," he interrupted, ending the call abruptly. Within 30 minutes, the scene outside the Ghanaian embassy had transformed. Military vehicles now occupied strategic positions on adjacent streets. Soldiers in Burkinabe uniforms stood at attention, their presence a silent statement of power. They made no aggressive moves, brandished no weapons, simply stood as living embodiments of state authority. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Minister Albert Badiono received identical envelopes delivered simultaneously to various diplomatic missions throughout Ouagadougou. Inside was a single page with an official government seal. In accordance with Article 7 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and Sovereign Prerogative of the Republic of Burkina Faso, all Ghanaian diplomatic operations within national territory are hereby suspended for a period of 72 hours pending review of bilateral relations. All embassy staff are to remain within diplomatic premises during this period. This measure takes effect immediately. The notice was signed not by a minister or diplomat, but by the president himself. His modest office in the presidential compound, far less ornate than those of his predecessors, Ibrahim Traoré sat reviewing agricultural production reports as if nothing unusual had transpired. His aide, Mariam Ouedraogo, entered with a tablet showing the rapidly unfolding social media response. Sir, the video has reached 2 million views. It's trending across West Africa. Traoré nodded without looking up from his papers. And the other matter? He asked. Exactly as you anticipated. The leaders of Mali and Niger have both called requesting urgent consultations. President Goïta sent a particular message saying, "The lions are finally roaring in their own jungle." For the first time that day, Traoré allowed himself a small smile. Schedule calls with both for this evening. And the Ghanaian reaction. Their foreign ministry has issued an emergency statement expressing profound regret for the unfortunate misunderstanding and requesting immediate diplomatic channels for resolution. Traoré turned a page in his agricultural report, studying irrigation figures for the northern provinces. "No response necessary," he said. "Let them feel the weight of silence." While diplomatic chaos unfolded in the capital, in the northern village of Teteo near the Mali border, 12-year-old Ajaratu Compare sat beside her grandmother, watching the family's only smartphone as the video replayed. The girl's father, a lieutenant in the Burkinabe army, had been killed 6 months earlier in a jihadist attack. "Grandma, why didn't the president get angry when they disrespected him?" she asked. The elderly woman adjusted her colorful head wrap and smiled. "Child, true power doesn't need to shout. The lion doesn't announce he is a lion. He simply is, and the forest knows." Across the village square, schoolteacher Pascal Sawadogo gathered his students under the shade of a massive baobab tree, their usual classroom when afternoon temperatures made their concrete building unbearable. "Today's history lesson has walked into our present," he told the children, holding up his phone showing President Traoré walking away from the Ghanaian embassy. "What does this image teach us about leadership?" A boy in the back raised his hand. "That our president is just like us. He doesn't need fancy clothes." "Yes," Sawadogo nodded. "But more importantly, it shows that respect isn't requested, it's commanded." At the Ghanaian embassy, panic had given way to crisis management. Ambassador Gambila paced his office while on a video call with President Nana Akufo-Addo himself, along with Ghana's National Security Advisor Dr. Aboaji. "How could this happen?" the Ghanaian president demanded, his normally measured tone sharp with concern. "We are already navigating delicate issues with Russia's growing influence in the Sahel. This incident plays directly into their narrative about Western disrespect. Sir, our guards followed standard protocol for unannounced visitors," Gambila explained weakly. "President Traoré deliberately came without identification or security." "He is the identification," Akufo-Addo interrupted. "He's the president of the republic where you serve. This isn't about protocol. It's about recognition and respect." Dr. Aboaji leaned forward on the video call. "Mr. Ambassador, our intelligence suggests this may not have been entirely spontaneous. 3 days ago, President Traoré visited a village where a French company had been operating a controversial gold mine. He promised the elders that no foreigner would disrespect Burkina Faso's sovereignty again. This incident creates a perfect narrative for him." Ambassador Gambila moved to his window, watching as a crowd began gathering across the street. They weren't protesting, not yet, but their presence was a message, a show of silent solidarity with their leader. "It's worse than that," he admitted. "We've received word that Russia's ambassador to Burkina Faso, Alexei Saltykov, has requested an emergency meeting with Traoré this evening." The implications hung heavily in the virtual room. Russia had been strategically expanding its influence throughout the Sahel as countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger distanced themselves from traditional Western allies. This incident provided perfect ammunition for the narrative that Western powers and their African allies didn't respect these nations' sovereignty. "Fix this," President Akufo-Addo said simply before ending the call. As evening fell over Ouagadougou, the story had transformed into something larger than a diplomatic incident. In markets and cafes, on street corners and in family compounds, the conversation was the same. A president who walked among his people without ceremony, who faced disrespect with dignity rather than forced it. The influential Radio Omega FM popular host Moussa Diallo devoted his entire evening program to the incident, taking calls from excited citizens. "For decades, we've had leaders who lived like kings while we suffered," said one caller. "Now we have a leader who looks like us, walks like us, and stands for our dignity." Another caller added, "The French treated us this way for years. Now Ghana too? When did African brothers start disrespecting each other?" The city's energy shifted as darkness fell. Spontaneous gatherings formed in neighborhoods across Ouagadougou. Not protests, celebrations. Young men on motorcycles rode through streets waving Burkinabe flags. Women gathered in doorways singing traditional songs of pride and resilience. The atmosphere wasn't angry. It was electric with something that had been missing for too long. Collective dignity at his home that evening. President Traoré hosted an unexpected guest. Contrary to security protocols and despite the diplomatic crisis, he had invited Fatou Bintou, the fruit seller who had recognized him outside the Ghanaian embassy, to bring her family for dinner. They sat in his modest courtyard, not in the lavish presidential palace favored by his predecessors, but in his personal home where he'd insisted on living despite security concerns. "Why did you invite us, Mr. President?" Fatou asked as her children shyly ate rice and peanut stew at the same table as the nation's leader. Traoré smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "Because today you reminded me why I serve. When our eyes met, I saw neither fear nor worship, just recognition between citizens of the same nation." Fatou's eldest son, a university student, leaned forward. "But sir, the video, everyone is saying you planned it all, that you knew they wouldn't recognize you." Traoré took a sip of water before answering. "When I was your age, I read Thomas Sankara's speeches religiously. He said, 'You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness.' Perhaps what looks like strategy is sometimes just that necessary madness." His phone buzzed with a message. Russia's Ambassador Saltykov had arrived at the presidential offices for their meeting, a meeting Ghana's intelligence services were undoubtedly aware of and concerned about. Traoré excused himself, but before leaving, he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Remember, sovereignty isn't just about flags and borders. It begins with how we carry ourselves, how we demand to be seen." At the presidential offices, Ambassador Alexei Saltykov waited with a knowing smile. The stocky Russian diplomat had been cultivating relationships throughout the Sahel as France's influence waned. "Mr. President," he began as Traoré entered, "a remarkable day for Burkina Faso's dignity. Russia understands what it means to stand against disrespect." Traoré took his seat, studying the Russian carefully. "I didn't come to discuss today's events, Ambassador. I came to discuss the military training agreement your government proposed last month." Saltykov's smile widened. "Of course, given today's demonstration of how your African neighbors treat you, perhaps our offer of advanced military equipment and training seems more appealing. Or perhaps," Traoré countered calmly, "it reveals that no nation, east or west, should assume they understand our path." The Russian's expression faltered slightly as Traoré continued. "Your equipment comes with expectations of political alignment. The Ghanaians' disrespect came with assumptions about our sovereignty. Neither recognizes that Burkina Faso charts its own course." Traoré slid a folder across the table, a modified version of the military cooperation agreement with significant changes. "We'll accept training for our special forces and anti-terrorism units, but no Russian military base on our soil. We'll purchase your equipment at market rates, not in exchange for mining concessions." The Russian's face remained impassive, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his pen. "That's not the arrangement we discussed." "No," Traoré agreed. "It's the arrangement worthy of equal partners." By the second day of the diplomatic suspension, international media had descended on Ouagadougou. CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC Africa, and France 24 broadcasted live from locations around the capital, their reports reaching audiences far beyond West Africa. The headquarters of the regional bloc ECOWAS in Abuja. An emergency session had been called. Nigeria's representative argued for mediation, while Côte d'Ivoire pushed for pressure on Burkina Faso to reverse its decision. Mali's representative stood to address the gathering. "Perhaps before we debate how to respond, we should ask why so many of our citizens celebrate this incident." Why does a simple act of a president walking away from disrespect resonate so deeply across our continent? On social media, the hashtags #RespectBurkinaFaso and #Chorewalks had spread across Africa and beyond. Artists created stylized images of the president's silhouette walking away from the embassy. Musicians from Dakar to Kinshasa released impromptu songs celebrating the president who walks like a citizen but stands like a nation. In Ghana, public opinion had turned sharply against their government's handling of the situation. Opposition parties called for the resignation of Foreign Minister Bachwe, while university students held demonstrations supporting Burkina Faso's right to respect. The Ghanaian parliament in Accra, Minority Leader Haruna Idrisu addressed his colleagues. When did we become the nation that treats African heads of state with contempt? Have we forgotten our own Kwame Nkrumah's vision of Pan-African dignity? On the morning of the third day, as the 72-hour diplomatic suspension neared its end, President Traoré visited Camp Guillaume Ouedraogo, the main military base in Ouagadougou, not for a formal inspection, but to sit with junior officers during their morning meal. "Sir," one lieutenant asked boldly, "there are rumors that Ghana threatened military exercises at our border in response to the embassy closure." Traoré continued eating his simple breakfast of rice and beans. "Let them exercise. We continue building." Another soldier leaned forward. "And the Russians, sir? Will we align with them now against our neighbors?" Traoré set down his spoon, looking each soldier in the eye before responding. "We align with our people, not with East, not with West." The dignity we showed at the embassy gate wasn't about choosing sides in someone else's game. It was about refusing to play that game at all. As he left the base, his phone rang with news he had been expecting. Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo had requested a direct call. When the two leaders spoke, the conversation was brief but substantive. Akufo-Addo personally apologized for the incident, announced the immediate recall of Ambassador Gambila, and proposed a face-to-face meeting in the neutral location of Lomé, Togo, to reset relations. Traoré accepted both the apology and the meeting proposal with characteristic brevity. Then he added one more thing, the only request he would make. "When we meet, Mr. President, let us both come without large delegations. Leader to leader, African to African. The solutions to our continent's challenges won't be found in grand hotels with foreign advisors whispering in our ears." After a moment's pause, Akufo-Addo agreed. That afternoon, President Traoré signed the order lifting the diplomatic suspension. As expected, international media portrayed it as a de-escalation, a return to normalcy after a brief crisis. But in Burkina Faso, people understood something different had happened. At a small primary school in Ouagadougou's outskirts, teacher Florence Ouedraogo pinned a newspaper photo to the classroom wall, the now famous image of Traoré walking away from the Ghanaian embassy. Beneath it, she wrote a quote from Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader whose legacy Traoré had revived. "We must learn to live the African way. It's the only way to live in freedom and with dignity." Later that week, when Presidents Traoré and Akufo-Addo met in Lomé, they arrived as promised in modest vehicles with minimal security, no red carpets, no ceremonial bands. Just two African leaders sitting face to face. What was discussed remained between them, but witnesses noted both men seemed to speak as equals, the younger revolutionary and the elder statesman finding common ground not through concessions or threats, but through mutual respect that asked for Ibrahim Traoré. He returned to Ouagadougou and immediately resumed work on agricultural reform plans he had been reviewing the day of the incident. No victory speeches, no celebratory rallies. When an aide suggested releasing an official statement about the resolution with Ghana, Traoré shook his head. "Our farmers in Banfora don't need statements. They need irrigation systems that work. Our dignity was never in question. Our development is the urgent matter." The aide hesitated, then asked the question many had wondered. "Sir, did you know they wouldn't recognize you at the embassy that day?" Traoré looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "The question isn't whether I knew. The question is why they didn't." In that simple response lay the essence of what had transpired, a lesson in leadership that would be studied in villages and universities alike for years to come. Not a lesson about diplomatic protocols or international relations, but something more fundamental. In a world accustomed to power announcing itself with sirens and ceremonies, Sometimes the most profound statement is simply walking as a citizen of your own land, carrying nothing but the dignity of your nation in your steps. And in this way, Ibrahim Traoré had rewritten not just a diplomatic incident, but the very language of power in a post-colonial Africa still finding its voice. Is power worth the price of paranoia? When a nation's leader must suspect even those closest to him, has he already lost the most precious freedom of all? The question hung in the air like a premonition as President Ibrahim Traoré's motorcade sliced through the heat of the afternoon. His time in office had changed him. 3 assassination attempts in the past year alone had transformed the once trusting leader into a man who viewed every shadow with suspicion, every smile as potentially concealing malice. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had more power than ever, yet he had never felt more imprisoned. The motorcade had been traveling for hours, visiting 3 remote villages as part of his Connect with the People initiative. The president's stomach growled audibly, breaking the tense silence in the armored SUV. He pressed a hand against his abdomen and glanced at his watch. 3:47 p.m. No wonder. They had missed lunch entirely. "We need to stop," Ibrahim announced, loosening his tie. "I haven't eaten since dawn." Marcel Cohn, his chief of security, immediately reached for his tablet. "Of course, Mr. President. I've already arranged for the chef at Hotel Magnificence to prepare a private meal. They've cleared the entire restaurant floor, and my team swept it an hour ago." Ibrahim stared out the window at the ordinary people going about their lives. Market women balancing baskets on their heads, children playing soccer with makeshift balls, taxi drivers arguing over fares. When was the last time he had experienced such ordinary moments? "No," he said quietly. "Sir." Marcel looked up from his tablet, brow furrowed. "I said no. I don't want another sterile, soulless meal in another empty restaurant surrounded by men with guns." Ibrahim's voice grew stronger with each word. "What's the point of my Connect with the People campaign if I never actually connect with the people?" Marcel's expression hardened. "With respect, Mr. President, after what happened in Bamako last month." "I know what happened in Bamako." Ibrahim cut him off sharply. The memory of the poisoned envelope that had killed his secretary still haunted him. "But I cannot lead from inside a bubble. Find me somewhere local, somewhere real." "Sir, the risk assessment—" "That's an order, Marcel." The security team exchanged glances loaded with unspoken concerns, but they knew better than to argue further. Ibrahim Traoré had not risen from village schoolteacher to president by being easily dissuaded. 20 minutes later, the motorcade pulled up to a modest roadside eatery called Mama Fanta's Place. The corrugated metal roof was rusted in patches, and the hand-painted sign was faded from years under the harsh African sun. The smell of grilled fish and cassava wafted through the open windows. Ibrahim breathed deeply, savoring the aroma of authentic local cuisine. This was what he needed, a reminder of the country he was fighting to improve. Marcel deployed his team with practiced efficiency. 2 agents entered first, 3 secured the perimeter, and 2 remained beside the president as they approached the entrance. The patrons inside froze mid-bite when the president walked in. A woman dropped her spoon. A child pointed. The owner, presumably Mama Fanta herself, a round-faced woman with intelligent eyes, nearly collapsed in shock before composing herself and rushing forward. "Mr. President, what an honor! What a blessing!" she exclaimed, bowing repeatedly. "Please, please, the best table for you." Ibrahim smiled warmly, gesturing for her to stop bowing. "Thank you, mother. Just treat me as you would any hungry traveler." They were led to a corner table that offered a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen. Marcel positioned guards at strategic points throughout the small restaurant while trying to appear casual. An impossible task given their earpieces and vigilant eyes that never stopped scanning the room. The other diners tried to resume their meals, but the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Some attempted to surreptitiously take photos with their phones until Marcel's quiet but firm intervention stopped them. Mama Fanta personally took the president's order. Fish stew with atik, a local specialty. She scurried away, shouting rapid-fire instructions to her kitchen staff. It was then that Ibrahim noticed him, a man slumped in the opposite corner of the restaurant. Unlike the other patrons who were stealing glances at the president, this man seemed oblivious to the commotion. He sat alone, surrounded by 3 empty beer bottles, staring into a fourth as if it contained all the secrets of the universe. Even from across the room, Ibrahim could see the man was a mess. His clothes were stained and rumpled, his beard unkempt. Every few moments, he would mutter something to himself and take another swig. "Who is that?" Ibrahim asked Marcel quietly. Marcel followed his gaze and frowned. "Local drunk, sir. He was vetted along with everyone else when we entered." Francois cleared him, no weapons, no apparent connections to any opposition groups. Ibrahim continued to observe the man. There was something about him, something in the slump of his shoulders that spoke of a burden carried far too long. Mama Fanta appeared with a steaming plate of food that made Ibrahim's mouth water instantly. The fish was perfectly cooked, the atik fluffy and fragrant. She placed it before him with a flourish. "Our very best for you, Mr. President," she said proudly. Ibrahim thanked her and picked up his fork. After a quick prayer of gratitude, he was about to take his first bite when a commotion erupted across the room. The drunk man had suddenly stood up, knocking his chair backward with a crash. His eyes, previously unfocused, were now wide and alert, fixed directly on the president. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a machete. "Don't eat that!" Marcel and his team instantly went into protection mode. 2 guards immediately flanked the president while others moved toward the drunk man, hands on their holstered weapons. "Stand down!" Marcel barked at the man. "On the ground now!" But the drunk man was undeterred. He staggered forward, pointing wildly at Ibrahim's plate. "The food! Don't touch it! Death sits on your plate!" The restaurant erupted into chaos. Patrons scrambled away from tables, some running for the exit. Mama Fanta stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth in horror. The security team had the drunk man on the ground in seconds, his face pressed against the concrete floor. He continued to shout, his words now slurred and muffled. "Check the food! Check it! For God's sake!" Ibrahim remained seated, outwardly calm despite his racing heart. Something about the man's desperate plea had struck a chord. He raised his hand. "Wait!" he commanded. "Let him speak." Marcel looked at him in disbelief. "Sir, this is a security breach. Let him speak," Ibrahim repeated firmly. The guards eased their grip slightly, allowing the drunk man to turn his head. "The food," he gasped, blood trickling from where his lip had split against the floor. "Something's wrong with it. I saw them put something in it." "Who?"
Ibrahim demanded.
"Who did you see?" The drunk man's bloodshot eyes darted toward the kitchen. "The young one, not Mama Fanta. The skinny boy with the scar on his hand." Marcel immediately dispatched 2 agents to secure the kitchen. Ibrahim's gaze never left the drunk man's face. "How do you know this?" he asked. The man laughed bitterly. "No one notices the drunk in the corner, Mr. President.
I'm invisible.
I see everything because no one bothers to hide from me." A commotion from the kitchen drew everyone's attention. The agents emerged, restraining a young man whose face was contorted with fear. In their other hand, an agent held a small vial filled with clear liquid. "Found this on him, sir," the agent reported. "He tried to wash it down the sink when we entered." The young man began to sob. "I didn't want to do it. They made me. They said they would kill my sister if I didn't." Ibrahim felt a cold wave wash over him. Another attempt. So close. He looked back at the drunk man, who was now being helped to a sitting position on the floor. Their eyes met across the room. The most powerful man in the nation and its most overlooked citizen. "What's your name?" Ibrahim asked. The man wiped blood from his chin with a trembling hand.
Claude Mensa."
"Why, Claude? Why would you save me? Most would say I've done nothing for men like you." Claude's bloodshot eyes held a startling clarity despite his inebriated state. Because beneath this bottle, Mr. President, I still remember who I was. A teacher, like you once were, and teachers protect their own. A teacher. The revelation hung in the air between them. Ibrahim felt something shift inside him, a connection to his past, to the ideals that had driven him to leadership before fear had begun to wall him off from his people. Take him to the car, Ibrahim instructed his security team, nodding toward Claude. And Marcel, I want to know everything about who was behind this. Everything. The presidential compound buzzed with unusual activity that evening. Security protocols were being rewritten. Staff members were being revetted. In his private office, Ibrahim sat across from Claude Mensa, who looked markedly different after a shower, clean clothes, and several hours of forced sobriety. 8 years, Claude was saying, his hands noticeably shaking from withdrawal. 8 years I taught mathematics at Central University, until the accident. Ibrahim listened intently as Claude described the crash that had killed his wife and daughter, the spiral into depression, the gradual descent into alcoholism, and finally, his dismissal from the university. So now I drink to forget, Claude concluded, staring at his trembling hands. And I watch. It's surprising how much you see when no one thinks you're looking. Like today, Ibrahim prompted. Claude nodded. I've been coming to Mama Fanta's for years. The boy in the kitchen, Seko, he's new, started last week. Today, 2 men visited him during his break. They showed him something on a phone that made him cry. Later, when your food was being prepared, I saw him sprinkle something from a vial. Ibrahim leaned forward. Did you recognize the men? One of them, Claude admitted reluctantly. He used to come to political rallies at the university. Very passionate about the opposition, always talking about revolution. Marcel, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward. We need a description, sir. Our team has Seko in custody, but he claims he never saw the men before. Claude closed his eyes, concentrating through the fog of his addiction. Tall, light-skinned, a scar across his left eyebrow. He wore a green shirt with gold buttons today. Expensive watch, too expensive for a regular citizen. Marcel's expression darkened. That sounds like Olivier Diallo. Former military, now works for Minister Conate, Ibrahim finished, his voice hollow. Marcel nodded grimly. Your Minister of Infrastructure. The same man who's been pushing for increased military spending rather than your education initiatives. Ibrahim stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the presidential gardens bathed in the golden light of sunset. Those closest to you cast the longest shadows. His father's words echoed in his mind. Marcel, I want Conate brought in for questioning. Quietly. No arrests yet. We need evidence before we move against a minister. Yes, sir. Ibrahim turned back to Claude, who sat uncomfortable in his fine surroundings, a fish out of water. And what shall we do with you, Claude Mensa, the man who saved the president's life? Claude's laugh was hollow. Give me enough money for a bottle and point me toward the gate. I've done my civic duty. Ibrahim studied the broken man before him. Beneath the ravages of alcohol and grief, he could still see traces of the respected professor, the scholar, the man of principle. What if I offered you something else? Ibrahim asked. A purpose, a chance to continue being my eyes where I cannot see. Claude's bloodshot eyes narrowed with suspicion. What are you talking about? I'm surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. I need someone who sees the truth, someone invisible, as you put it. You want to employ a drunk as what, a spy? Ibrahim shook his head. Not a spy, an advisor, someone who remembers what it's like to live among the people I serve. Someone who can tell me hard truths. Claude stared at him in disbelief. You're either desperate or insane. Perhaps both. Ibrahim admitted with a small smile. But first, we get you sober. Medical treatment, counseling, whatever it takes. Claude's face crumpled, a complexity of emotions washing over him. Why would you do this? Why not just give me a medal and send me on my way? Ibrahim sat back down, leaning closer. Because today I realized something. I've been so focused on protecting myself from enemies that I've cut myself off from the very people I'm supposed to lead. I need to bridge that gap, Claude. And I think you, someone who has lived in both worlds, can help me do that. You're asking a lot from a drunk who happened to be in the right place at the right time.
No, Ibrahim countered.
I'm asking a lot from the teacher who never stopped observing, even when the world stopped noticing him. 3 months later, President Ibrahim Traoré caused a stir by appointing a new special advisor for public engagement, Professor Claude Mensa, freshly rehabilitated and back to his former sharp-minded self. The appointment raised eyebrows throughout the political establishment. Rumors circulated. Who was this unknown academic? Why had he been plucked from obscurity? What qualified him for such a sensitive position? Only Ibrahim, Marcel, and Claude himself knew the full story, how a fallen man's keen observation had saved a president's life, and how that president had, in turn, saved him. In the ongoing investigation, Minister Konate had been implicated in the assassination plot. Electronic transfers to the opposition extremists were discovered. A wider conspiracy was slowly being uncovered, with tendrils reaching into surprising places, including Ibrahim's own security detail and his darkened office late one evening. Ibrahim reviewed the latest security briefing with Claude. The evidence was mounting against several high-ranking officials. It's worse than we thought, Claude observed. The rot goes deep.
Ibrahim nodded solemnly.
And yet, I find myself more hopeful than I've been in years. How so? Because now I understand. True security doesn't come from walls and guards. It comes from connection, from being so tuned to the heartbeat of the nation that you can feel when something is wrong. Claude smiled slightly. A philosophical president. That's dangerous. Not as dangerous as an isolated one, Ibrahim replied. He stood and walked to the large map of the country that dominated one wall. Tell me, Professor, where should we visit next on our unannounced tour of local eateries? Claude joined him at the map, his finger tracing the outline of a region. The northern provinces. They feel forgotten, especially during this drought. Ibrahim studied the area. Can we trust the regional security team? After Marcel's purge? Probably. But that's not the point, is it? The risk is the purpose. Ibrahim raised an eyebrow. Explain. Every time you break protocol to connect with ordinary citizens, you show them they matter more than your own safety. It's why they're beginning to trust you again. Ibrahim considered this, then nodded slowly. North it is, then. And Claude. Yes, Mr. President. Thank you. Not just for saving my life that day, but for helping me remember what I'm saving it for. Outside the window, the capital city stretched before them, its lights twinkling like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere in those streets, plots were still being hatched, grievances nursed, power coveted. But somewhere in those same streets, children were studying, families were dreaming, and citizens were beginning to hope again. The nation was both fragile and resilient, much like the two men who now worked to guide it, each saved from his own particular darkness, each finding in the other an unexpected light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly storytelling sessions. Which character resonated with you more, President Ibrahim or Professor Claude? Let us know in the comments below. The chandeliers cast a soft glow across the ballroom of the Grand Hotel Ouagadougou. Crystal glasses clinked, waiters glided between tables with silver platters, and the sounds of soft jazz floated through the air. It was the annual International Investment Gala, where money, power, and influence converged in Burkina Faso's capital city. Ibrahim Traoré entered quietly through a side door. No security detail, no fanfare, no announcement. He wore a simple dark blue tunic over black pants, elegant but understated. To most eyes, he looked like just another African businessman, perhaps a local entrepreneur lucky enough to score an invitation. But this man was not ordinary. He was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, that he preferred evenings like this, moving among the people, listening, observing, staying grounded. Tonight was no different. He had just finished a week of crucial diplomatic meetings about gold mining rights, agricultural sovereignty, and the future of West African economics. Now, all he wanted was to experience this gathering as a citizen first, leader second. Ibrahim nodded politely to the hostess, who smiled back without recognition. That's how Traoré liked it. He made his way to table 7, near the center of the room, and took his assigned seat. No one noticed. No one cared. Or so he thought. 3 tables away, Philippe Beaumont, CEO of Energy Pro, one of Europe's largest energy conglomerates, was fuming. The Frenchman expected the royal treatment, the best table, the finest wine, the most attentive service. Instead, he found himself seated at table 10, slightly off-center, partially blocked by a column. "This is unacceptable," he hissed to his assistant. "I fund half the projects in this country. I deserve better placement." Philippe wasn't used to hearing the word no. To him, Africa was still a continent where European money opened all doors, changed all rules. The drama was building quietly at first, just a small demand that would soon become a storm. "Find the event coordinator," he ordered. "Now." Minutes later, Camille Devereaux, the tall, elegantly dressed French event planner, arrived at his table. Her practiced smile remained fixed as Philippe made his demands. "I need a better table, front and center. Make it happen." Camille scanned the room, her eyes calculating. "The gala is fully seated, Monsieur Beaumont." However, her gaze paused when it fell on table 7, where Ibrahim sat quietly checking messages on his phone. "Perhaps we can make an adjustment," she said. Her eyes lingered on the dark-skinned man in the simple clothes. To her, he didn't look like someone who belonged at the center tables. She approached Ibrahim with a practiced smile. "Excuse me, monsieur. May I see your invitation?" Ibrahim looked up calmly and handed her the embossed card. She examined it, glancing between the card and the man, doubt evident in her eyes. The table number was correct, but something inside her didn't sit right. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said with a thin smile, "but we need to make some adjustments to accommodate an important guest. Would you mind relocating to table 15? It's by the window, lovely view." There it was, the insult quiet but sharp. Ibrahim raised an eyebrow. "And why me?" he asked calmly. "No particular reason," she replied, trying to maintain composure. "Just a small adjustment for our VIP." "A guest more important than me?" he asked, voice still measured. Camille didn't answer directly. She merely maintained her smile. Other diners glanced over, sensing tension, but no one intervened. Ibrahim sat back. "No, I will remain at my assigned table." Camille was stunned. A man like him saying no to her? She wasn't accustomed to that, especially not from an African guest, especially not at her event. Her smile remained fixed, but her tone cooled. "Monsieur, I insist. This is for organizational purposes." But Traoré didn't flinch. He met her gaze directly. "If it's organizational, please explain why I'm being asked and not anyone else at this table." Camille hesitated. She wasn't prepared for this calm resistance. Around them, several guests were now paying attention. A diplomat lowered his fork. A banker stopped mid-conversation. Something didn't feel right, but no one spoke. Philippe hadn't yet moved. He was being kept at his table until the situation was resolved. Camille walked briskly to the kitchen, whispered something to the head waiter, then returned with renewed determination. She didn't approach Ibrahim again. Instead, she moved to another black guest at table 8, then another at table 6. She was clearly targeting only certain attendees, those who, in her eyes, didn't belong in the premium seats. That was her second mistake. Traoré sat silently and watched. His face remained expressionless, but his mind was calculating. The discrimination didn't anger him. It focused him, a young African man, perhaps a tech entrepreneur from Ghana, looked bewildered as Camille now pointed at his chair. "Excuse me, monsieur, we need you to move to the back tables." The young man frowned. "Why me?" Camille said nothing, merely held out her hand for his invitation. That's when Traoré stood up. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "You are making decisions based on skin, not on invitations. That's called discrimination." Camille tensed. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to sit down. Please don't cause a scene." Traoré looked directly into her eyes. For a second, her breath caught. There was something about his stare, steady, fearless, powerful, but she still didn't know who he really was. To her, he was just another troublemaker disrupting her perfect event. She walked away, fuming inside. To her, this was getting out of hand. "These people," she muttered under her breath in French, "always making noise." Philippe was finally escorted to table 7. Camille greeted him with exaggerated deference, pulling out his chair and signaling for champagne. "We've resolved the seating issue, Monsieur Beaumont," she said. Meanwhile, Traoré calmly retook his seat. He adjusted his napkin across his lap. His fingers tapped the table lightly. He didn't need to say a word, because soon the entire room, and beyond, would know exactly who had been insulted. Philippe settled at the table like a king claiming his throne. He barely glanced at Ibrahim as he sat down beside him. Camille made sure the Frenchman was comfortable, bringing him the wine list personally and offering appetizers. The message was clear: you matter, that man does not. The dinner commenced. Speeches began at the front of the hall. Beautiful plates of food arrived at each table. On the surface, everything appeared normal. But beneath it all, something powerful was growing. An invisible storm waiting to break. Traoré remained composed. He didn't complain or raise his voice. He didn't call anyone or reveal his identity. He simply sat quietly, like a man watching a play unfold, knowing exactly how it would end. Midway through the main course, Camille returned to his side with a forced smile. "Is everything to your satisfaction, monsieur?" He glanced at her. "The food is fine." She nodded quickly and walked away. No apology, no courtesy, no respect. Philippe, meanwhile, was treated like visiting royalty. Camille laughed at his jokes, leaned in when he spoke, and inquired about his important projects in Africa. He replied loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Burkina Faso is lucky to have us. We're bringing structure to chaos." Camille nodded in agreement, completely unaware that the very man he was insulting sat just inches away. A woman at the table, the Minister of Health returning from a conference in Geneva, noticed everything. She shook her head slightly and whispered to her neighbor, "That's our president they're humiliating." Her neighbor's eyes widened in disbelief, but they said nothing. The president clearly didn't want attention, and no one dared break the silence. The dinner progressed. Dessert was served. The event's host announced the final speaker of the evening, the Minister of Finance, who would introduce a special guest. Ibrahim discreetly checked his watch. Outside the ballroom doors, unnoticed by the guests inside, a convoy of black SUVs had arrived. Presidential guards in formal uniform lined the hotel lobby. The Minister of Defense, the Foreign Minister, and the head of security stood waiting in the corridor, straight-backed and expressionless. Inside, Philippe was pontificating to the table about European investment strategies when the ballroom doors opened. A tall officer in a black beret entered, followed by 6 presidential guards. The room fell silent as they marched directly toward table 7. The officer stopped beside Ibrahim's chair. He raised his hand in a perfect military salute. "Monsieur President," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "We are ready when you are." The entire ballroom froze. Camille, who was pouring wine at a nearby table, nearly dropped the bottle. Her eyes darted between the officer and the man she had tried to displace. Her hands began to tremble. Ibrahim slowly stood up, calm and dignified. Not a word spoken. Philippe's face drained of color. "President?" he stuttered. Traoré gave him a simple nod. Not angry, not proud, just a man who no longer needed to say anything. Another officer approached the table. "We have instructions," he said coldly, looking at Camille and Philippe. "You two will come with us immediately." "What? Why me?" Camille whispered. her composure finally breaking. "You are being detained for questioning," the officer replied sharply. "You have publicly disrespected the head of state at an official function. That is a serious offense." Camille laughed nervously, looking around the room for support. No, this has to be a mistake. I was doing my job." But no one came to her defense. Traoré walked toward the podium, immediately surrounded by his people, his guards, his ministers, and now a room full of standing guests showing belated respect. Cameras flashed as the nation's leader took the microphone. The president spoke calmly, without anger, but his words landed with precision. "In Burkina Faso, we don't look at a person's clothes or skin to measure their worth. We don't bow to foreign money or colonial habits. Here, we respect dignity, humanity, and our sovereignty. That is the new Africa." Meanwhile, Camille and Philippe were escorted out through a side door, their protests dying on their lips as they faced the consequences of their actions. Gone were their smug smiles. Gone was the arrogance. In its place, shock, confusion, and the sudden realization of who they had tried to humiliate. They were led to separate vehicles waiting outside, surrounded by elite presidential guards. No one spoke to them, not even the officers. The silence was deafening, the silence of power reclaimed, of dignity defended. By midnight, the story had spread across the capital. By morning, videos were leaked online, footage of the arrest, images of the military saluting Traoré, clips showing Philippe and Camille being escorted out looking shell-shocked. Social media exploded. #RespectAfrica and #IStandWithBurkinaFaso trended globally. African youth across the continent celebrated, cheering a moment they'd never forget. The Ministry of Justice, Camille and Philippe were formally charged with public insult toward the head of state, disrespect on Burkinabe soil, and discrimination. The French embassy scrambled to intervene. Phone calls were made, diplomatic requests submitted. Traoré's response was clear. "This is not a colony. This is a sovereign nation. They will face justice like anyone else." Energy Pro issued a public statement within 24 hours, a clumsy apology filled with corporate language and shallow regret. It wasn't enough. Burkinabe citizens began calling for a boycott of the company's products. Other West African nations joined in solidarity. Camille, now in a detention center outside Ouagadougou, broke down during questioning. "I didn't know who he was," she sobbed. "I was just following protocol." The investigator looked at her without sympathy. "You didn't need to know who he was. You just needed to treat him like a human being." Philippe, facing potential legal action in both Burkina Faso and France, tried using his connections to escape consequences. The court's ruling was powerful. No immunity, no special treatment. Let justice be equal. Traoré never gloated. He never mocked them. He simply returned to the presidential palace and continued his work, building infrastructure, empowering youth, strengthening security, defending sovereignty. But that evening at the Grand Hotel became legend. A quiet man in a simple tunic, an event planner with prejudice, a CEO blinded by privilege, and a dinner that changed everything. The most dangerous weapon on Earth isn't a nuclear warhead or a biological agent. It's the smile of someone who's already decided to betray you. When Dr. Catherine Michaels landed at Ouagadougou International Airport, nobody questioned why an American environmental scientist would choose Burkina Faso as her research destination. Nobody asked why her equipment cases weighed more than most research gear. Nobody wondered why her eyes lingered too long on military checkpoints or why her questions about local uranium deposits seemed oddly specific. They simply saw her credentials from Princeton University, her USAID partnership documents, and her disarming smile that made even the most suspicious guard lower his weapon. "I'm here to help document environmental degradation in the Sahel," she would say, her French flawless, her handshake firm but gentle. President Traoré's commitment to sustainable development is exactly why I chose Burkina Faso. The country believed her. After all, she brought water filtration systems to 3 villages. She hired local assistants. She donated scientific equipment to underfunded universities. When photographing erosion patterns, She made time to teach children how to use her cameras. She seemed genuine, the rare Westerner who came to Africa not to extract, but to contribute. But behind that warm smile and those intelligent hazel eyes lay something far more calculated. The soil samples she collected weren't just measuring contamination levels. The drought patterns she documented weren't merely climate research. The locals she interviewed weren't simply research subjects. Dr. Catherine Michaels was hunting something else entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Fatou Diallo watched the American woman through binoculars from 200 meters away. 2 weeks of surveillance hadn't revealed anything conclusive, but Diallo's instincts, honed through 15 years in Burkinabe military intelligence, told her something was wrong. She's spending too much time near the Chinese mining operations. Diallo murmured to Captain Ouedraogo beside her. Yesterday marked her third visit to the perimeter. The Chinese are extracting rare earth minerals there, Ouedraogo replied. If she's an environmental scientist, it makes sense. And the satellite phone calls every night at precisely 2:13 a.m.? The USB drives she buries behind her guest house? The facial recognition software running continuously on her laptop. Ouedraogo frowned. You've been in her room? Not personally, but we have our ways. Diallo lowered the binoculars. President Traoré wants daily reports. I think he's preparing something. What neither officer knew was that President Ibrahim Traoré had already received intelligence that went far beyond their surveillance. 3 weeks earlier, a high-level American intelligence asset in neighboring Mali had defected, bringing with him a treasure trove of classified information, including Operation Saharan Shield, a multi-layered espionage program targeting the new wave of anti-Western governments across the Sahel. Dr. Catherine Michaels was listed as Field Operative Sandstorm, a NOC, non-official cover, agent using environmental research as her cover. Her real mission: map Chinese-African military cooperation, identify weak points in Traoré's security apparatus, and gather intelligence on Russian private military contractors allegedly training Burkinabe special forces. But Traoré, the 34-year-old military officer who had seized power 2 years earlier, wasn't simply waiting for her to complete her mission. He was setting a trap of his own, one that would change the balance of power in West Africa forever. The environmental conference at Ouagadougou University was Catherine's perfect cover. Presenting her research on soil degradation gave her legitimate reasons to show maps, discuss resource extraction, and network with officials who might unwittingly provide valuable intelligence. Dressed in a simple linen blazer over a white blouse, her curly brown hair pulled back in a professional ponytail, she appeared exactly what her cover suggested: a dedicated scientist passionate about environmental justice. The correlation between these extraction sites and groundwater contamination is alarming, she explained to the audience, highlighting satellite imagery on the projector. What she didn't mention was that the seemingly innocent environmental maps contained embedded geographical coordinates of military installations, data that would be extracted by specialized software when she transmitted her research findings back to Langley as she fielded questions. She noticed a striking woman in military uniform at the back of the auditorium, watching intently without taking notes. Their eyes met briefly, and Catherine felt an unexpected chill despite the oppressive heat. Later that evening, as she typed her daily field report in encrypted text, Catherine's satellite phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The president requests your expertise at tomorrow's environmental security briefing. 10 a.m., Presidential Palace. Transportation provided. Catherine stared at the message, her heartbeat accelerating slightly. This was both an incredible opportunity and a potential risk. Direct access to Traoré would be an intelligence coup, but something felt wrong. After 3 weeks of careful networking, why would such an invitation come so suddenly? She sent a coded message to her handler. Unexpected summit invitation. Protocol advice. The response came back quickly. Proceed. Unprecedented access opportunity. Eclipse parameters authorized. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Eclipse parameters meant she was cleared to place surveillance devices if possible. An extreme risk, but with potentially enormous rewards. She deleted both messages and continued packing her equipment for tomorrow's meeting, including the specialized camera pen that could capture 360-degree images undetectably. What she didn't know was that her encrypted transmission had been intercepted hours earlier, Every word she typed, every file she encrypted, every call she made was being monitored by an elite cybersecurity team assembled by President Traoré from specialists trained in Russia and China. As Catherine prepared for her mission across the city, Lieutenant Colonel Diallo was preparing too, checking the battery on a recording device and reviewing the dossier that would expose America's most sophisticated intelligence operation in West Africa. The presidential palace gleamed white against the dusty ochre landscape of Ouagadougou. Catherine was escorted through several security checkpoints, each more thorough than the last. Her specialized equipment had been carefully concealed. The camera pen looked ordinary, the radiation detector disguised as an asthma inhaler, the specialized phone appearing as a standard model despite its advanced capabilities. The final security checkpoint required her to surrender her phone. She handed over her decoy device, keeping her actual communications equipment hidden in a specially designed compartment in her leather portfolio. "Dr. Michaels," a deep voice called out as she entered the conference room. "We're honored by your presence." President Ibrahim Traoré stood before her, younger in person than he appeared in photographs, his military posture impeccable, his eyes sharper than she had anticipated. Despite being only 34, his presence commanded the room. "The honor is mine, Mr. President," she replied smoothly, extending her hand. "Your commitment to environmental protection despite security challenges is remarkable." Traoré's handshake was firm, his smile measured. "Please join us. We have much to discuss about Burkina Faso's environmental future." The conference room was smaller than Catherine expected, with just 8 people present, 3 military officers including the woman she'd noticed at her lecture, 2 men in civilian clothes, and what appeared to be technical staff operating camera equipment. "We're documenting all high-level consultations for our national archives," Traoré explained, noticing her glance toward the cameras. "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," Catherine replied, setting her portfolio on the conference table. "Transparency is essential for environmental work." For the next 30 minutes, the meeting proceeded normally. Catherine presented her findings on soil contamination near extraction sites, carefully avoiding any mention of her observations regarding nearby military installations. Traoré asked intelligent questions, demonstrating surprising technical knowledge for a military leader. Then, without warning, the tone shifted. "Dr. Michaels," Traoré said casually, "your analysis of our northern territories is quite detailed. Tell me, did you find anything interesting near Gorom during your soil sampling?" Catherine maintained her composure despite internal alarm. Gorom wasn't part of her official research areas, but it was a location where she had secretly documented a suspected Russian military training facility. "I haven't conducted sampling there," she answered smoothly. "My permits only cover the southern regions." Traoré smiled slightly. "Interesting, because we have satellite imagery of your vehicle in that exact location 3 days ago. Perhaps your memory needs refreshing." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as a soldier activated a wall screen displaying high-resolution photographs. Catherine's vehicle parked near a restricted area, Catherine herself using telephoto lenses aimed at a military compound, GPS coordinates that matched classified locations. "Perhaps," Traoré continued, his voice still conversational, "you could also explain these." The screen changed to show nighttime infrared images of Catherine burying something behind her guest house. Close-ups of her specialized equipment with CIA identification markings clearly visible, and most damning, a screenshot of an encrypted email with the header Operation Saharan Shield. Asset placement opportunities near presidential compound. Catherine's training had prepared her for many scenarios, but not this level of comprehensive surveillance. She had been compromised from the beginning. "There must be some mistake," she began, but Traoré raised his hand. "Please, Dr. Michaels, or should I say, Agent Michaels? Let's not insult each other's intelligence." He nodded to Lieutenant Colonel Diallo, who placed a folder on the table. Catherine and Michaels, born September 14, 1988, in Bethesda, Maryland. Princeton undergraduate degree, followed by alleged doctoral work at Georgetown University's Environmental Science Department, except Georgetown has no record of your dissertation. 3 years at USAID before your reassignment to environmental consulting. Your actual employer is the Central Intelligence Agency, Special Activities Center, deployed under non-official cover as part of Operation Saharan Shield. Catherine remained silent, her mind racing through protocols, extraction possibilities, diplomatic implications. Her training was clear: deny everything, request diplomatic representation, reveal nothing. "I am an environmental scientist," she stated firmly. "These accusations are absurd. I demand to speak with the American embassy immediately." Traoré leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Before you continue that line, you should know that we have already spoken with your handler, Mr. Phillips. He's currently being questioned by our allies in Mali after attempting to activate an extraction team for you." Catherine's blood ran cold. If they had captured her handler, the entire regional network was compromised. "This meeting isn't being recorded for our archives, Dr. Michaels," Traoré said quietly. "It's being broadcast live across Burkina Faso and neighboring countries. Right now, millions of Africans are watching an American spy being exposed in real time." Catherine turned toward the cameras, suddenly understanding their true purpose. This wasn't an intelligence operation gone wrong. It was political theater on an international scale. "You came to study us," Traoré continued, his voice now addressing the cameras directly, "to map our defenses, to undermine our sovereignty. You brought water filters as props while searching for our vulnerabilities." He turned back to Catherine. "You came for our story. Now you are the story." The interview footage spread across Africa like wildfire. Within hours, it had been viewed by millions, a calm, methodical exposure of Western espionage that left no room for denial. Catherine Michaels became the unwitting symbol of continuing Western interference in African affairs in Washington. Emergency meetings convened at the State Department and CIA headquarters. The exposure of Operation Saharan Shield threatened American intelligence operations across the entire Sahel region. 3 other NOC agents were immediately extracted from neighboring countries before they too could be exposed in her detention cell. Comfortable but secure, Catherine reviewed her options and found none. Her training had never prepared her for such a comprehensive failure. The Americans would deny everything, of course. They would claim she was an environmental scientist being framed for political purposes. But the evidence Traoré had presented was irrefutable. What she didn't know was that her exposure was only phase 1 of Ibrahim Traoré's larger strategy. 3 days after Catherine's public exposure, Lieutenant Colonel Fatou Diallo entered the detention facility. Unlike their previous encounters, this time she came alone, without uniform, without cameras. "Good morning, Dr. Michaels," she said, sitting across from Catherine. "Or do you prefer Catherine?" "Either is fine," Catherine replied cautiously. "Am I being interrogated again?" Diallo smiled slightly.
No.
"Today I come with a proposition." She placed a folder on the table, different from the one that had exposed Catherine's identity. "Before joining military intelligence, I spent 5 years investigating corporate corruption in resource extraction. Your environmental research, though a cover, actually documented real contamination patterns." Catherine remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "President Traoré has reviewed your actual findings, not the intelligence reports you were preparing, but your legitimate environmental data." Diallo opened the folder, revealing Catherine's unaltered research. "The contamination levels you documented near the Chinese mining operations are worse than we suspected." "Why are you telling me this?" Catherine asked. "Because Traoré is planning something unprecedented. Tomorrow, he will announce new environmental regulations for all foreign mining operations. The Chinese will claim economic warfare. The French will threaten to withdraw development aid. The Americans will call it resource nationalism." Diallo leaned forward. "We need your legitimate expertise to defend these regulations scientifically." Catherine laughed bitterly. "You exposed me as a spy, and now you want my help? Why would I assist the man who destroyed my career?" "Because you're more than your cover, Catherine. Your academic credentials are real. Your environmental passion, before the CIA recruited you, was genuine." Diallo's eyes held Catherine steadily. "And because it's your only way home." The proposition was clear. help legitimize Traoré's environmental regulations against foreign mining companies, and earn deportation instead of a public espionage trial. What exactly would this involve? Catherine asked carefully. A new kind of press conference. Not an exposure this time, but a collaborative presentation. You present your actual findings on contamination levels with full scientific integrity. You acknowledge your dual role, express regret, and support evidence-based environmental protection. President Traoré announces new regulations with you as scientific advisor. And if I refuse, then we proceed with your espionage trial, which will further damage American standing in the region while doing nothing to address the environmental destruction your research actually documented. Catherine considered her options. Cooperation meant betraying her mission but serving her original environmental values. Refusal meant upholding intelligence principles while abandoning the legitimate environmental concerns she had discovered. I'll need assurances, she said finally. Of course, President Traoré anticipated this. Diallo handed her another document, terms for her cooperation, including guaranteed deportation to the United States following the joint presentation, and a commitment that her legitimate environmental data would not be altered. Why does he trust that I won't use this platform to deny everything? Diallo smiled. Because he doesn't have to trust you. The evidence against you is already public. Any denial now would only make you look desperate. Besides, she added, I think you actually care about the environmental damage you documented. Catherine didn't respond immediately. The situation was unprecedented in her training. Yet there was something compelling about this offer. A chance to reclaim some part of her authentic self that had been buried under layers of deception. I'll consider it, she said finally. Good, Diallo replied, standing. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. As Diallo left, Catherine wondered if this was yet another layer of manipulation, using her genuine environmental concerns to serve Burkina Faso's political agenda. Yet she couldn't deny that the contamination she had documented was real, regardless of her ulterior motives for collecting the data. For the first time in years, Catherine Michaels faced a choice between her assigned mission and her original purpose, between being an intelligence asset and being a scientist, between perpetuating deception and reclaiming some measure of truth. The press conference was unlike anything international media had ever witnessed in West Africa. President Ibrahim Traoré and Dr. Catherine Michaels sat side by side, captor and captive, president and spy, now unlikely allies in environmental regulation. I came to Burkina Faso with dual purposes. Catherine began, her voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. My cover was environmental research, but my assigned mission was intelligence gathering. What I didn't expect was that my cover research would reveal environmental violations that cannot be ignored, regardless of political conflicts. She presented her data methodically, contamination levels, groundwater impacts, health implications for local communities, while Traoré watched with measured approval. When Catherine finished, Traoré approached the microphone. Dr. Michaels came to map our weaknesses. Instead, she documented how foreign corporations have poisoned our land. Today, we use her evidence, gathered through deception but scientifically sound, to take control of our environmental destiny. He announced sweeping new regulations for all mining operations in Burkina Faso, requiring environmental impact assessments, community consent protocols, and remediation funds. The Chinese representatives looked stunned. The French diplomats whispered urgently into their phones. American officials were conspicuously absent. These regulations aren't anti-foreign, Traoré emphasized. They are pro-Burkinabe. All companies willing to respect our environment and our sovereignty are welcome. Those unwilling must leave. As cameras flashed and journalists shouted questions, Catherine realized she was witnessing a masterful political maneuver. Traoré had transformed an intelligence failure into environmental policy, neutralized a spy by converting her into a reluctant ally, and positioned himself as a defender of both national sovereignty and environmental protection. The press conference concluded with an announcement that Dr. Michaels would be deported the following day, having cooperated with Burkinabe authorities in addressing environmental violations. As they left the podium, Catherine whispered to Traoré, "You've been 3 steps ahead the entire time, Haven't you? Traoré's expression remained neutral, but his eyes conveyed quiet satisfaction. We are no longer the Africa you expected to find, Dr. Michaels. Remember that when you return home. Catherine's deportation was handled quietly, without the media spectacle that had accompanied her exposure. As she boarded the plane under escort, Lieutenant Colonel Diallo handed her a sealed envelope. President Traoré asked me to give you this. Don't open it until you're in the air. Hours later, flying over the Atlantic, Catherine opened the envelope to find a USB drive and a handwritten note. Dr. Michaels, this drive contains complete evidence of environmental violations by Western and Chinese corporations across the Sahel, information your government has ignored for decades while focusing on regime change and resource control. Your scientific credentials make you the perfect person to ensure this data reaches environmental organizations that will act on it. You came to steal our secrets. Instead, I give you this one freely. Africa's future will be determined by Africans. The era when a smile and a camera could unlock our doors is over. We see you now. And we expect you to see us as we truly are. Ibrahim Traoré. Catherine stared at the note and the USB drive, understanding the elegant trap she now faced. If she turned the drive over to her CIA handlers, the environmental data would likely be buried. If she followed Traoré's suggestion and released it to environmental organizations, she would be defying her agency while advancing foreign policy interests of a government hostile to American influence. Yet the scientist in her, the real Catherine Michaels before the CIA, recognized the importance of this data for communities suffering from environmental degradation. As the plane continued toward Washington, Catherine Michaels faced the most difficult intelligence decision of her career. Follow her training or follow her conscience. Complete her mission or complete her original purpose. The choice she would make would reverberate far beyond one failed operation in West Africa. It would challenge the fundamental assumption that had defined decades of Western engagement with the continent, that Africa's resources, whether material or informational, were there for the taking. And exposing one American spy, Ibrahim Traoré had sent a message to all foreign powers operating in the shadows of the Sahel. We see you now. And in the dawning light of that new awareness, the old certainties of power and influence began to shift, like shadows retreating before the African sun. Is loyalty simply another commodity to be bought and sold in the shadow markets of ambition? In Burkina Faso, where coups are as familiar as the dry harmattan winds, the answer often depends on who's asking the question and how much they're willing to pay for the response they seek. President Ibrahim Traoré could smell death before it arrived. Not in the metaphorical sense that powerful men often claim, but in the literal, visceral way that only those who have crawled through battlefields recognize. Death had a particular scent. Metallic, sharp, with undertones of something sickeningly sweet. And on this sweltering Tuesday afternoon, as he sat beneath the sprawling mango tree at Military Base Alpha 7, that familiar odor seemed to cling to the rim of the small ceramic teacup placed before him. Please, Mr. President, you must try it while it's hot, urged Colonel Yaya Konate, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't match the intensity in his eyes. Our new chef has prepared it specially, a blend from the northern provinces. The circle of military officers and advisors seated around Traoré watched with varying degrees of interest. Some appeared genuinely engaged in the logistics discussion about eastern border operations. Others, Traoré noted silently, seemed unusually focused on whether or not he would drink. Traoré lifted the cup with practiced precision, inhaling the aromatic spices. Cardamom, clove, ginger, and something else. Something chemical and faint. He smiled genially, the practiced smile of a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts in his first year of leadership. You know, Colonel, my grandmother used to say that tea reveals character, Traoré remarked, rotating the cup slowly in his hands. The patient await its cooling, the impulsive burn their tongues, and the suspicious. He paused, his eyes locking momentarily with Captain Ousmane Zongo, his head of security standing discreetly at the perimeter. The suspicious study the leaves rather than drink the brew. Konate's laughter came slightly too quickly. Your grandmother was wise, sir. But this tea is perfectly safe. Look. He lifted his own cup and took a deliberate sip, his Adam's apple bobbing prominently as he swallowed. What Konate didn't know, what only 3 people in all of Burkina Faso knew, was that 6 hours earlier, a folded note had appeared on Traoré's private desk. They've chosen porcelain over politics. The cup carries more than tea. Trust no one who insists you drink first. A friend of the lion, the note had been delivered by one of the palace's elderly cleaning women, who claimed a foreign man in dark glasses had paid her 10,000 CFA to place it directly on the president's desk. Traoré had immediately ordered a sweep of the palace grounds, finding nothing, before gathering his most trusted security advisors. It could be a trap, Captain Zongo had warned. Someone trying to create paranoia, make you distrust your inner circle. Minister of Defense Kabor had agreed. Psychological warfare, sir. They want you looking over your shoulder instead of forward. But Traoré had survived the jungle trenches of Mali as a young lieutenant. He had outlived 3 coup attempts as a general. And now, as president, he understood that paranoia wasn't a weakness but a survival skill. We proceed as scheduled, he had decided. But prepare contingencies. Now, beneath the mango tree, Traoré set his cup down without drinking. You mentioned the Eastern Operation timeline, Colonel? I believe we were discussing deployment schedules. A flash of something, irritation? Anxiety? Crossed Konate's face before he composed himself. Of course, Mr. President, but your tea will get cold. I prefer it that way, Traoré replied, his tone courteous but final. Now, about those troop movements. The meeting continued, but something fundamental had shifted. The young server who had brought the tea stood rigidly at attention near the refreshment table, eyes fixed forward, sweat beating more profusely than the heat warranted. Konate kept glancing between Traoré and the untouched cup, his contributions to the strategic discussion becoming increasingly distracted. After 40 minutes of detailed operational planning, Traoré stood suddenly. Gentlemen, a short break. Captain Zongo, would you accompany me? He gestured casually toward the military compound's main building as soon as they were out of earshot. Traoré whispered, "The server, detain him quietly, and the cup, secure it without touching the contents." Zongo nodded once, already speaking coded instructions into his sleeve microphone. When Traoré returned to the gathering 10 minutes later, the server was gone, as was his teacup. Colonel Konate sat stiffly, his earlier affability replaced by visible tension. "I apologize for the interruption," Traoré announced. "Unfortunately, I've received urgent intelligence that requires immediate attention. We'll need to reconvene tomorrow." Before anyone could protest, Traoré's security detail had formed a protective formation around him. As they escorted him toward the waiting vehicle, Traoré paused beside Colonel Konate. "You know, Yaya," he said softly, using the colonel's first name for perhaps the first time in their professional relationship. "My grandmother had another saying, a man who prepares poison should always brew enough for 2. The color drained from Konate's face. "I don't understand, Mr. President." "You will," Traoré replied. "Tonight, in the holding cells beneath the palace. I hope, for your sake, that understanding comes quickly." The underground detention facility of the presidential palace, known informally as the Silence, had never officially existed. Constructed during French colonial rule and expanded during the turbulent decades following independence, its existence was denied in all official records. The walls were 3 feet thick, reinforced concrete lined with sound-dampening materials. No screams escaped. No confessions were recorded. Colonel Yaya Konate sat alone in interrogation room 4, his wrists secured to the metal table with standard-issue handcuffs. The room contained nothing but the table, 2 chairs, and a single overhead light that buzzed intermittently. A large mirror occupied one wall, obviously two-way, not even attempting to disguise its surveillance function. The door opened after 3 hours of isolation. Captain Zongo entered carrying a small tray with 2 ceramic cups, identical to those from the afternoon meeting. Behind him came Dr. Aisha Awadrago, the nation's leading toxicologist and head of the university's forensic science department. "Colonel," Zongo said, his voice neutral as he placed the tray on the table.
There.
Konete's laugh was hollow. "Is this supposed to be ironic?" Zongo didn't respond, instead turning to Dr. Ouedraogo, who placed a thin file folder on the table. "Preliminary analysis of the substance in your teacup, Colonel," she said, her academic tone clinically detached. VXT-42, a synthetic neurotoxin developed in Eastern European laboratories approximately 7 years ago. Colorless, odorless, virtually undetectable except through specialized tests. It causes paralysis beginning with the respiratory system, leading to asphyxiation within 4 to 6 minutes after ingestion. Death appears to be natural, a sudden cardiac event. Very difficult to detect in standard autopsies unless specifically sought. She opened the folder, revealing chemical composition charts and graphs. Interestingly, it's extraordinarily rare, not commercially available, not sold on black markets. Its distribution is strictly controlled by the governments who possess it. Which raises the question, how did a military colonel in Burkina Faso acquire such a sophisticated assassination tool? Konate remained silent, his expression hardening into practiced neutrality. Zongo leaned forward. "The server has already talked, Colonel. Private Moussa Diallo, 22 years old, recruited from your home village, distant cousin of your wife's family. He's quite eager to explain how you promised his family a new home and education for his siblings in exchange for his special service today. This is absurd." Konate finally spoke. "I'm being framed. I've served this country for 27 years. And served yourself for how many?" Came a new voice as President Traoré entered the room. The president wore no uniform today, just a simple white boo-boo. He carried nothing, not even the ceremonial walking stick that had become his public trademark. He seemed smaller without the trappings of office, but somehow more dangerous, a predator who had shed unnecessary weight before the hunt. Traoré pulled out the chair across from Konate and sat, his movements unhurried. "Do you know what disappoints me most, Yaya?" he asked, his voice soft. "Not the betrayal itself. I've come to expect that in our line of work. It's the lack of originality. Poison? In tea? At a military meeting? Is practically a cliché." Konate said nothing. "Here's what I don't understand," Traoré continued. "You're wealthy already. I've seen your Swiss accounts. Yes, I've known about those for months. You have 2 villas in Abidjan, a penthouse in Paris. Your children attend elite schools in Europe. Why risk it all? What price was worth this gamble?" Konate's composure cracked slightly, his eyes widening at the revelation that his foreign assets were known. "You don't understand the pressures," he began, then stopped himself.
Traoré nodded.
"So there were pressures. From whom?" Konate stared at the table. Traoré sighed. "Captain, please show the colonel what you found in Private Diallo's quarters." Zongo produced a small black notebook, placing it on the table and flipping it open to a page filled with what appeared to be coded entries. "This contains meeting dates, payment amounts, and a communication cipher," Zongo explained. "Our cryptography team is working through it now, but they've already decoded references to something called Operation Glass Chalice and multiple mentions of someone known as Le Chacal, the Jackal." At the mention of this name, Konate flinched involuntarily. "Ah," said Traoré. "Our mysterious jackal seems to frighten even you, Colonel. Interesting. You don't understand what you're dealing with," Konate muttered, his earlier defiance crumbling. "If I talk, I'm dead. If my family talks, they're dead. There are forces at work beyond Burkina Faso, beyond Africa even." Traoré leaned forward. "I'm well aware of the international vultures circling our resources. France hasn't accepted losing its colonial grip. China craves our minerals. America fears our strategic position. Russia sees opportunity in our instability. I'm not naive, Yaya." "Then you know why I had no choice," Konate whispered. "There is always a choice," Traoré replied sharply. "Always." He stood abruptly. "Captain Zongo will outline your options now. Option 1. Full cooperation. identification of all conspirators, complete written testimony, in exchange for your family's protection and relocation. Option 2. Silence, trial for high treason, public execution, and your family left to fend for themselves when your foreign friends no longer find them useful. Traoré moved toward the door, then paused. You have 1 hour to decide. After that, I address the nation about today's events, with or without the full story. As the door closed behind the president, Konate slumped in his chair. He doesn't understand, he whispered. Luchakal is everywhere. He has eyes in every embassy, ears in every ministry. Then help us find him, Zongo said, sliding a pen and paper across the table. Before he decides you've become a liability. Alexander Moreau, known in certain European intelligence circles as Luchakal, sat at the small desk in his luxury apartment in Ouaga 2000, Ouagadougou's upscale district favored by diplomats and expatriates. The room was sparsely furnished. A bed, a desk, 2 chairs, and high-end communication equipment disguised as ordinary electronics at T-54. Moreau maintained the physical discipline of his military past. His gray-blonde hair was cut short, his posture impeccable even in private. His face, once handsome in a severe way, now bore the permanent creases of someone who rarely smiled except as a tactical maneuver. Officially, he was a cultural attaché to the French embassy, a position that required his presence at diplomatic functions but demanded little actual work. Unofficially, he operated in a shadowy realm between formal intelligence services and private security firms, his true employers varying depending on the contract. The burner phone on his desk vibrated once. Moreau checked the message. Package undelivered. Courier detained. He closed his eyes briefly, processing this failure. Colonel Konate had been compromised. The operation, 6 months in planning, had collapsed. Worse, it had left evidence. Moreau wasn't concerned about Konate revealing his identity. The colonel knew him only as Luchakal, had met him only twice, in darkened rooms with Moreau's face partially concealed. But Konate knew enough about the operation's funding sources and objectives to create significant diplomatic problems that he needed to extract quickly, but not so quickly as to confirm his involvement. A hasty departure would only validate suspicions. No, he needed something more sophisticated, a reason to leave that appeared entirely unrelated to today's failed assassination. Moreau opened his laptop and accessed a secure communication channel. Phase 1 compromised. Initiate contingency Raven. Require extraction window within 72 hours. The response came quickly. Raven authorized. Presidential dinner tomorrow night provides opportunity. Proceed with Phase 2 alternative. Moreau smiled thinly. His employers had anticipated failure and prepared accordingly. There would be another chance, and soon he opened a hidden compartment in his desk drawer and removed a small vial similar to the one that had failed earlier that day. VXT-42 was extremely difficult to acquire, but his connections had secured enough for multiple attempts. The plan would need adjustment. With Konate detained, he would need a new asset within the presidential security detail. Fortunately, he had cultivated several over the months, including one who would be working tomorrow's private presidential dinner. Moreau picked up a different burner phone and composed a message to a number saved under the name Viper. Tomorrow night, same package, triple compensation for expedited delivery. As he waited for confirmation, Moreau reflected on President Ibrahim Traoré, the target who had proven surprisingly difficult to eliminate. A former mid-level officer who had risen through genuine battlefield competence rather than political connections, Traoré had seized power 3 years ago after the previous military government had grown too corrupt even by West African standards. Unlike his predecessors, Traoré had displayed troubling signs of actual patriotism. He had renegotiated mining contracts to increase Burkina Faso's share of its own mineral wealth. He had reduced the French military presence while building relationships with newer partners who offered better terms. Most dangerously, he had begun uniting neighboring countries into a resource alliance that threatened decades of carefully maintained neocolonial economic arrangements. Such independence could not be tolerated. Example needed to be made. Burkina Faso was meant to be a warning to other African nations contemplating similar defiance. The burner phone vibrated with Viper's response. Confirmed. will require credentials for kitchen access. Moreau sent the necessary details, then methodically destroyed the phone, breaking it into pieces and flushing the memory card down the toilet. As night fell over Ouagadougou, he performed his security ritual, checking the locks, the window sensors, the escape route through the building service corridor. Tomorrow would require perfect execution. There would be no third chance. By midnight, Colonel Konate had broken. Not from physical coercion, President Traoré had forbidden such methods, knowing they often yielded unreliable information, but from psychological pressure and the simple, devastating reality of his situation. Abandoned by his foreign handlers, facing certain execution, with his family's safety hanging in the balance, Konate had chosen survival over loyalty to his mysterious employers. His confession, recorded on video and transcribed into a 30-page document, detailed a conspiracy spanning 2 years. Foreign mining interests, alarmed by Traoré's resource nationalism, had collaborated with elements of the French intelligence service to orchestrate a natural transition of power. Konate had been promised the presidency following Traoré's unfortunate health crisis, with guarantees of international recognition and economic support. Most importantly, Konate had confirmed the identity of Le Chacal, Alexander Moreau, operating under diplomatic cover from the French embassy and the Presidential Situation Room, a secure underground facility beneath the palace gardens. Traoré studied the dossier assembled on Moreau. His record is impressive, remarked Defense Minister Kabore. Former French Foreign Legion, then DGSE operations in West Africa, before supposedly retiring to private consulting 5 years ago. Never trust a spy who retires, Traoré said, eyes still scanning the file, especially when they remain in the field. Captain Zongo entered the room carrying a tablet. Sir, we've intercepted a communication from a palace security staff member, Sergeant Traoré, no relation to you, to an unknown number. He's been compromised. Traoré looked up sharply. Content? He's confirmed his assignment to tomorrow night's dinner service and requested specific instructions. A slow smile spread across Traoré's face. Perfect. Now we have our opening. Sir, Kabore looked confused. We don't arrest Moreau, Traoré explained. Not yet. French diplomatic immunity would complicate matters, and a public incident could spark exactly the international crisis our enemies want. No, we turn their operation against them. He stood, pacing the room as his plan formed. Tomorrow's dinner proceeds as scheduled. We allow Sergeant Traoré to believe his communication remains secure. We even help Moreau's plan progress almost to completion. That's extremely dangerous, Mr. President, Zongo protested. The margin for error is slim, Traoré acknowledged, but the evidence we gather will be irrefutable. Foreign intelligence operations on our soil, attempting to assassinate a head of state, documented beyond denial. He turned to his communications director. Prepare a diplomatic package with copies of all evidence. If anything happens to me, it goes immediately to the United Nations, the African Union, and select international media outlets. And if we succeed, asked Kabore. Traoré's expression hardened. Then we demonstrate that Burkina Faso is not a chessboard where foreign powers move pieces at will. We show that Africa's sovereignty is not negotiable. Through the night, they refined their counter-operation. Sergeant Traoré would be monitored but allowed to proceed, believing himself undetected. The dinner would include only trusted officials briefed on the situation. The food would be prepared under strict supervision with multiple security personnel disguised as kitchen staff. Most crucially, they planned for Moreau himself to attend, not as a guest, but as the trap closed around him. Dawn broke over Ouagadougou as the final preparations were put in place. President Traoré, having not slept, stood on the palace balcony, watching the city awaken. Street vendors set up their stalls. Children walked to school. Taxi drivers began their day's work. Ordinary citizens unaware that their nation's future hung in precarious balance. A beautiful morning, remarked Captain Zongo, joining him on the balcony. Yes, Traoré agreed. Let's ensure there are many more to come. The presidential palace dining room gleamed with understated elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the hand-carved mahogany table set for 6 guests. Fresh-cut bougainvillea and hibiscus flowers adorn the center, their vibrant colors contrasting with the crisp white tablecloth. President Traoré had selected his guests carefully. Defense Minister Kabor, Finance Minister Ouedraogo, the Army Chief of Staff General Sankara, and two surprising additions, the Chinese Ambassador Lin Wei and Russian Trade Representative Mikhail Petrov. Their presence served multiple purposes. Witnesses from powerful nations not aligned with France, potential new allies in the coming diplomatic storm, and most importantly, complications for any assassin hoping to strike without international consequences. At precisely 7 p.m., Captain Zongo reported from the Security Command Center established in an adjacent room. Sergeant Traoré has arrived for his shift. He appears nervous but is proceeding according to plan. No sign of Moreau yet, but our surveillance team reports movement at his apartment. He left 20 minutes ago in a diplomatic vehicle. Traoré nodded. And our countermeasures? In place, sir. Dr. Ouedraogo has prepared the neutralizing agent. Each real drink will contain it, harmless to consume but will instantly render VXT-42 inert upon contact. Additionally, all security personnel have been issued the antidote injectors as a precaution. Excellent. Let's begin. The dinner commenced with practiced diplomatic formality. Conversation flowed naturally through regional security concerns, trade possibilities, and cultural exchanges. President Traoré played his part perfectly, engaged, charming, seemingly unaware of any threat. He ate 17 p.m. During a pause between the main course and dessert, Sergeant Traoré entered with a special tray of digestive liqueurs, a traditional West African bitter cola-infused spirit reserved for honored guests. Mr. President, he announced with only the slightest tremor in his voice. The chef has prepared this special selection to complement the evening. Traoré smiled warmly. How thoughtful. Please, serve our guests first. This deviated from protocol. The president was always served first, but Traoré had no choice but to comply. As he distributed the small crystal glasses, Captain Zongo's voice came through Traoré's nearly invisible earpiece. Movement at the service entrance. Diplomatic vehicle just arrived. One passenger matching Moreau's description has entered through the kitchen. Traoré maintained his pleasant expression. Before we drink, I propose a toast to new partnerships and sovereign futures. The guests raised their glasses. Sergeant Traoré stepped back, his eyes darting repeatedly toward the service door. One moment, Traoré said, placing his glass down untouched. I believe we're missing someone. Captain Zongo, would you please invite our kitchen visitor to join us? The service door burst open as security personnel rushed in, surrounding a startled Alexander Moreau, who had been caught observing from the kitchen threshold. Simultaneously, other officers detained Sergeant Traoré, who had been reaching for something inside his jacket. Moreau's composure faltered only momentarily before his training reasserted itself. What is the meaning of this? I am a diplomatic representative of the French Republic. This is a violation of international law. Traoré stood calmly. Cultural attaches rarely carry military-grade communication devices and unmarked vials of neurotoxins, Monsieur Moreau. Or should I call you Lu Chakal? The Russian and Chinese representatives exchanged glances, their presence suddenly making strategic sense. These accusations are absurd. Moreau insisted as security personnel removed several items from his pockets, including a small vial identical to the one found earlier. I was invited to deliver an urgent diplomatic message. By whom? Traoré asked. That is confidential diplomatic. There was no invitation, Traoré interrupted, just as there was no legitimate reason for you to be monitoring a private presidential dinner, coordinating with a compromised security officer who was planning to poison me. He gestured to Dr. Ouedraogo, who had entered carrying a portable testing kit. She took Sergeant Traoré's serving tray and tested the remaining liqueur. Positive for VXT-42, she announced after a moment. Same concentration as the previous sample. Moreau's expression hardened as he realized the depth of the trap. His eyes darted around the room, calculating, but finding no escape. Ambassador Lin, Representative Petrov, Traoré addressed his international guests. I apologize for involving you in this security operation without your knowledge. As you can see, Burkina Faso faces extraordinary interference in its sovereign affairs. I invite your governments to observe the evidence we have gathered and the legal proceedings that will follow. The Chinese ambassador nodded slowly. China respects African sovereignty and condemns all forms of foreign interference in the internal affairs of independent nations. The Russian trade representative was more direct. We will be very interested in the investigation's findings, particularly regarding which entities authorized such operations. Moreau remained silent as security officers escorted him from the room. Unlike Colonel Konape, he would not break under interrogation. His training was too thorough, his connections too powerful. But his capture alive, with evidence, before international witnesses, was devastating enough as the dinner concluded and the guests departed. Captain Zongo approached Traoré. Congratulations, Mr. President. The operation was a complete success. Traoré shook his head. This was merely the first move in a much longer game, my friend. Our real work begins now. 3 days later, President Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation from the steps of the National Assembly building. Behind him stood his cabinet, military leadership, and representatives from neighboring countries. The square before him was filled with thousands of citizens, their faces solemn yet proud. Citizens of Burkina Faso, he began, his voice steady and clear in the morning sunlight. I stand before you today not to announce a crisis, but to confirm our sovereignty. He recounted the assassination attempts in measured terms, factual, without inflammatory rhetoric. He explained the evidence of foreign interference, the involvement of international actors, and the corruption they had fostered within Burkina Faso's own institutions. But this is not a story of victimhood, he continued. It is a testament to our resilience. Those who sought to control our resources by eliminating our leadership have failed. Those who believed our sovereignty was negotiable have been answered. He held up a simple ceramic teacup, the same one from which he had refused to drink days earlier. This ordinary cup was meant to carry death to your president. Instead, it now carries a message. Burkina Faso will chart its own course. We will choose our own allies. We will manage our own resources. We will determine our own destiny. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Today, I am announcing the establishment of the West African Resources Alliance, a cooperative agreement between Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire to collectively negotiate resource contracts, security arrangements, and development partnerships. Together, we will ensure that Africa's wealth benefits African people first. In diplomatic quarters across Ouagadougou, the speech was watched with varying reactions. At the French embassy, officials drafted urgent cables to Paris. At the Chinese and Russian missions, analysts prepared reports highlighting new opportunities. In American diplomatic offices, strategies were reconsidered. Alexander Moreau, meanwhile, sat in a specialized detention facility outside the capital. Unlike the public story of his sudden return to France for health reasons, he remained in Burkina Faso as a secretly held prisoner, a bargaining chip for future negotiations and a source of ongoing intelligence about networks operating throughout the region. Colonel Konape, having cooperated fully, had been transferred with his family to a secure location pending the completion of formal legal proceedings. His public trial would come, but not until all the information he provided had been thoroughly exploited. That evening, in the presidential palace, Traoré met with Captain Zongo in the private garden where they often spoke most candidly. The international reaction, Traoré asked. As expected, Zongo replied. France has issued formal denials and demanded Moreau's return, claiming he's been kidnapped. They've threatened economic consequences but are careful not to mention the assassination attempts. The evidence we shared with select partners has prevented more aggressive responses. And our new allies, the Resource Alliance countries, have confirmed their commitment. Russian and Chinese representatives have already scheduled meetings to discuss new infrastructure and security projects. Traoré nodded thoughtfully. And the note? Have we identified who warned us? Zongo shook his head. Not yet. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. It could have been someone inside the French system with an attack of conscience. Or perhaps another intelligence service with its own agenda? We may never know. Keep looking, Traoré insisted. I don't like owing unknown debts. As twilight descended over the capital, Traoré contemplated the ceramic teacup he had brought from his office. The cup that had nearly ended his life, now transformed into a powerful symbol. Tomorrow, it would be placed in the National Museum as part of a special exhibit on Burkina Faso's struggle for true independence. But the real victory wasn't capturing Moreau or exposing the plot. It was what would happen next. Resource contracts renegotiated, military agreements rewritten, development partnerships restructured, all on more equitable terms. The assassination attempt, ironically, had created the perfect opportunity to accelerate the very changes it had been designed to prevent. Traoré smiled as he considered the ancient wisdom his grandmother had often repeated. When your enemies dig a pit for you, use the soil they remove to build your foundation. The foundation was now laid. The real building could begin.